On January 11th, South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol made a startling offhand remark about acquiring nuclear weapons. In a rambling question and answer session, he said, quote, "The Republic of Korea could deploy tactical nuclear weapons or possess its own. If that happens, we'll be able to get hold of them sooner with our science and technologies." So I want to talk through three questions. What does he mean? What are the implications? And how should the Biden administration respond? First, some context. Discussion in South Korea about acquiring nuclear weapons is actually fairly common. If you look at public opinion polls, something like 70% of the public supports acquiring nuclear weapons in some way. And with the perception that the threat from North Korea is increasing and fears that the U.S. protection, namely the alliance, U.S. troops deployed in South Korea, and the U.S. nuclear umbrella, is no longer sufficient to deal with the North Korean threat. So Yoon is saying that if the North Korea threat keeps increasing, he would want the U.S. to deploy its own nuclear weapons on South Korean territory, and failing that South Korea would develop its own. This comes off as something of a tacit threat against the United States, maybe some alliance bargaining if you are charitable in the reading, but it's very heavy-handed and could well backfire on him. Now, turning to the implications, I think you have to say that politically this is very risky. It's not uncommon for Korean politicians to make statements like the one that Yoon has made. It's another thing entirely for a serving South Korean president to make this statement. Indeed, it's very rare for leaders of any state to muse publicly about breaking legal commitments not to acquire nuclear weapons. Now, some South Koreans believe that if they acquired nuclear weapons, they would be safer, and that North Korea would have to negotiate disarmament. But rarely does the discussion in South Korea consider the risks and the costs. The likelihood that there would be a much deeper and more dangerous arms race, higher likelihood of nuclear weapons being used in a conflict, the probability that China will react very harshly, including through new economic sanctions, the cutoff of international supplies to South Korea's nuclear energy program, which provides around 30% of its electricity generation, and the potential breach of the alliance with the US. Now, this presents something of a dilemma for the Biden administration. On the one hand, in an era of new geopolitical competition, alliances are really important, and no doubt the Biden administration wants to retain the alliance with South Korea. But this is an exceptionally irresponsible remark by President Yoon and can't simply be ignored by the Biden administration. I think it's incumbent on them to remind South Korea that the fundamental bargain that goes with U.S. security guarantees is that South Korea does not seek nuclear weapons. I think it's important the U.S. can stress the continued commitment to a strong alliance that deters North Korea, but be clear that these types of statements are not helpful and must stop.